Hi, and welcome to the Unreal Engine News and Community Spotlight. So our first item this week, Carbon Studios has written a nice article on how they used UE4 to make VR magic with their The Wizards project. It's a really great VR project. You're a wizard and you have all these magical abilities, but they walk through how they were able to, as a small team, leverage a lot of the tools in Engine to make a really sweet project. So do go check that out. We also have an article on how Unreal Studio helped enable CityEngine, or bring CityEngine to life. So they're taking a lot of Brazil's favelas and bringing them into this scene. And they walk through how you can procedurally develop a neighborhood and set up rules and guidelines for how those are shaped, and then using Unreal Studio and Datasmith to import all that data into the engine and just bring these grand cities to life. So definitely take a look at that. It's really cool how they're leveraging those tools. We've also announced our NVIDIA Edge recipients for the month of March. We have the Modular Sci-Fi Project, the Zero Dome, which is a sweet VR arena game, and a VIP Shelter reproduction. Lots of really amazing stuff, and as always, we encourage you to submit your projects to the NVIDIA Edge program. I would love to send you a GTX 1080 Ti provided from NVIDIA, and we get to see all the cool stuff you're working on, so don't forget to do that. It's also PAX East week. If you're a UE4 dev, make sure to find all the Unreal Engine folks that are out at the event and let us know. Shout at us on Twitter, at Unreal Engine. Let us know you're there. We'd love to see what project you're working on. And if you're there, also, just have a great time. We also have a great article on how Unreal Engine helped HBO and Rewind create the hacker hostel from Silicon Valley. So if you're a Silicon Valley fan, they've set up a VR scene of the hacker hostel. If you want to take a look at how all that was developed and check it out, definitely a fun read. And we also have a really great article from Sam Diter on one mesh to rule them all. So this talks about how Fortnite is leveraging the engine and using a single mesh across all various platforms. So you have your single mesh, you want it on mobile, you want it on console, you want it on PC, and how do we leverage that ability to make your game more accessible across all of those things. So take a look, there's a lot of great stuff there. On to our community spotlight. These folks are doing amazing stuff and helping with our weekly karma. They're answering questions, aiding their fellow community members, so we'd like to give a huge shout out to Thompson N13, Nebula Games Inc., GKOR 0R, Shadow River, Evil Cleric, T. Sumisaki, Jin VE, Yuki Ogino, Vaheva, and Gigasite Media. Thank you guys for all your help. You guys are the bomb. So our first community spotlight is actually this Crab Rave by Noisestorm. So we saw this pop up the other day around April Fool's. It's a really fun project. It's just this music video that he's created. I definitely recommend watching the whole thing. It's just a lot of fun. But the scene itself looks really beautiful. We don't see a whole lot of music videos being created in the engine, and it's really awesome to see how folks leverage our tools and create different kinds of projects. So great job with that. It's a really fun project. Our second community spotlight item is a game called Boltstorm. It's created by Kuality Games. So this is a dungeon crawler action game. It combines unique army mechanics with roguelike elements. So you're fighting as this mighty crusader king that's been betrayed by his mad brother. And so your job is to build an army, equip your best weapons, armor, and storm out of the dungeons and face enemies and bosses that are guarding him. So this was recently released, so definitely go check it out. It's available on Steam. Or you take a look at it on Steam. It's good stuff. And our third and final community spotlight project this week is a military communication room. So it's actually this individual's first project from scratch, from end to end in Unreal. They've done a really amazing job. They created their own models in Maya and ZBrush, and have worked on creating this nice little scene. So I thought they deserved a shout out. It looks awesome. I hope you keep working in the engine. there's a lot of neat stuff going on here. So keep it up, man. And that's it for our news and community spotlight. Hey folks, welcome to our Unreal Engine live stream. I'm your host, Amanda Bott. With me, I have Tim Slaker, fellow community manager.
Hey everybody.
And this week we have Dan Reynolds, our technical sound designer
Hello.
out in Seattle. Thank you for joining us
How's
this
everyone
morning.
Good, man.
Yeah,
It's
thanks for
a
having
little
me.
chilly here. How are things out there?
It's, believe it or not, it's kind of raining.
Rainy in Seattle. Never.
What?
Never would have thought.
It's impossible.
That never
Those community
happens.
spotlights are awesome, and that crab rave is incredible.
Right? You ready to like party up?
I think somebody said they were going to put that on a screen during a crab fest or something. Yeah.
Yeah, everybody just do the...
Do the crab. Is that a dance? I'm not.
Do the crab.
No.
I'm not like a dance person.
It is now.
It
Just
is.
go for it.
It just became a dance.
Yeah, no, we're always really excited with all the kinds of things that our community does. It's super impressive, and it's really an honor for us to be able to kind of give them a shout out and be like, these are the cool things that you all make. We love it. So, yeah.
It's,
Always
Well,
feel
3
free
or
to
4
tell us
years
what you're
ago,
doing.
I was a community spotlight for a music system, actually.
What?
So, dreams do come true.
Is that the path?
That's the path. That's
music
it.
system, and then join Epic.
That's
All
right.
So, give us an overview of what you're going to be discussing today.
Yeah. So I'm a technical sound designer. My role is here in Seattle. I work with the audio engine development team under the lead audio programmer, and my role is to essentially consult with them on feature design, to test, demonstrate, and then kind of teach about the new stuff, features, and make things, basically cool things, and then to assist and support and community sort of endeavors. So so today I wanted to talk about like kind of a sort of a music system, or an approach to a music system. A few weeks ago, an internal team here approached me, and they wanted me to kind of help them create a music system, and then it worked out nicely, and it was just the timing was right for GDC, so we just brought it to GDC, and a lot of people seemed to like it. So for this stream, we were like, hey, why not talk about this music stitching system? So that's the plan.
All right.
So, how long have you been in the audio engineering space? How long have you been doing it?
A long time, man.
Yeah,
A long time.
couple years.
So yeah, a couple of years. So before joining Epic, I was a freelancer for about 10 years, and I've worked on everything that freelancers work on. Anything you can get your hands on, which thankfully included some cool projects. Like I worked with LucasArts on the special edition of Monkey Island 2. I've done some work with Eidos and THQ and a whole bunch of indies you've never heard of. So it's just a mix of music production, sound design, implementation, etc. So
Gotcha.
yeah, kind of a big, huge bundle.
Hands are everywhere, right? You do have little of everything.
Yeah, well, like if you're a freelancer, then you just, everything you can do is a potential job.
Right.
Every individual skill you have is a potential job. So you just do it all.
That's awesome. Well, I can't wait to see building a music system in Blueprints. I think it's just neat,
Yeah.
the diversity and functionality and flexibility of Blueprints. The fact that you can just,
Blueprints is incredible. Yeah,
it's insane.
absolutely.
Oh.
Feel free to, you want to
So
dive right in?
Yeah, let's switch over to my slides here, and I'll give you cues for the videos.
Cool.
All right, so yeah, real quick, I want to get. So I have some slides, and I do this just because I want to give context. When you dive into blueprints, it's really easy to get sort of lost in the weeds, and so I just have these just quick series of slides to provide sort of forest for the trees context. So when I talk about music stitching, this basically what I'm talking about is a system that allows you to link multiple music clips together, and that creates an illusion of continuous music. So, why would you want to do that? Like, you can play a single continuous file, and that's fine, and a lot of games do, but that sort of creates a kind of billboard effect, right? Like a sort of wallpaper. And games, the fun part of games, in my opinion, is interactivity, right? So what music stitching allows you to achieve is basically allows you to bring in the benefits of sort of traditional music production techniques and compositional techniques, things like recording live musical performances from musicians, any sort of hardware or software stuff that just is not available inside of a game engine or would be impractical to try to reproduce in real time. So, to bring those kinds of cool things in, but also try to create an experience, a continuous and cohesive music experience for your user, listener, that takes advantage of the fact that it's an interactive game or project, and that we have like logic that can drive decisions. So here, as an example, trying to stitch some clips together, we have, say, something like you play music clip A, and then based on some sort of game data, you pick music clip B or music clip C, and the illusion would be to the listener that this is continuous music, right? That this is a continuous single piece of music. So that's the goals of a music stitching system, and why we like music stitching. So there are some challenges that we have to face when trying to handle a music stitching system. And part of that is that our logic that drives our music, the stuff that we glean from the game, lives on a game thread, right? And so our game thread is not always going to adhere to the musical synchronicity of our compositions, right? And you wouldn't necessarily want it to. Like it'd be nice maybe, but your music it should have tempo and that is as flexible as the actual like aesthetic experience that you're trying to reproduce. That is not necessarily bound by a tick, a specific game thread tick. And in the Unreal Engine, our game thread is synchronous to our video frame rate. So if your game is running at 30 frames per second, that means your game thread update is happening at 30 frames per second. And so one of the problems that we see here with a music stitching approach is that as we try to say, if we want to move from music clip A to music clip B, when music clip A ends, it might end between two tick updates. Right here I have, say, green little arrows representing my tick update, and then here is my execution to start clip B. And as you can see, there's a gap in when music clip A ends and music clip B begins. So that's sort of a challenge, and you just try to overcome that in some way, right? So approaches that I've taken in the past, approaches that have made me a community spotlight member in the past, is to actually write music that is fluid or flexible in its tempo, in a way that when gaps appear in the timing, they don't appear unnatural. They seem like a normal part of the music experience. And so, like, as an example here, I could have music clip A playing, but it's written in such a way that the timing is more flexible or fluid, And then I add sort of maybe like some tail, so I don't have complete digital silence as I traverse a potential gap. So so that's nice, and it can actually work. I think it's still a valid approach, and it's actually quite a simple approach to set up. And it's the problem though is that it's not necessarily applicable to all cases, right? So so it's something to consider, but it's not going to fit all. Not one size fits all kind of thing, and there really is no one size fits all. So you kind of have to mitigate your specific issue or whatever you're trying to achieve, and build around that. This comes to the project that the internal team I mentioned earlier had sort of brought to me, and that was they had some sort of presentation. It was kind of an interactive presentation, and the way that the presentation worked was there would be some sort of choreographed sequence, and then it would wait for user input. And then the user would do some sort of input, and then it would play another sequence, and then wait for user input again, and then play another sequence and wait for user input, and so on. And so it had this sort of alternate sort of, hey, we're doing a thing, and then we're waiting for the user to do something. And while the user you wouldn't have to necessarily wait a long time for the user to figure out what they had to do. It was sort of a timing issue. And when they came to me, they said, hey, we have this linear piece of music. And when I say linear, it was written actually for a short film. So back in when Unreal Engine went free to download, they released a short animated film or trailer, I don't know what you would want to call it, about a boy and his kite and the sadness and joy of letting something you love go. And it was set to this beautiful music that was very flowing and moving, but was not interactive or built for interactivity in any way. And I think this is actually a common scenario in games, in game studios. Like game studios will acquire a license for some sort of linear piece of music and then need to make it interactive. So it's sort of a common issue. And so I was like, okay, cool, I can do that. I can edit everything. And I sat with the project designer, and we sort of ironed out the types of energy states. I isolated, say, steady state opportunities for a loop, and I edited those out. And then I found transition moments and basically made a new arrangement of the piece, but one that would support looping at points, basically. And so, but the problem was that I couldn't take advantage of this tail because I literally sliced the music out of the file. So there was no forgiving tail. I just had to mitigate this gap. And so I had to have these seamless transitions into a loop, inside of a loop, and then out of a loop, and had to sort of figure out a way around that. So this is the approach I took on this particular thing. And one of the things I was lucky about is that we were using the new Unreal Audio Engine. For people who don't know, my lead and basically my team, Aaron and Ethan, small team, Aaron McLaren and Ethan Geller are working on completing the new Unreal Audio Engine. And basically what this means is that in the past, before the new Unreal Audio Engine, we sort of had all of our source data and we just handed it off to the platform. And we said, here you go, Windows, or here you go, PlayStation, here you go, Xbox, mix it together, do your thing. And so in the past, there wasn't really like a core audio engine. We just used whatever the platform audio engine was. And this kind of put us in some difficult spots. Like one of the things that we were missing was like platforms all have different features, right? So there was a lot of disparity between the platforms. And but also one of the things is that we sort of, it was out of our control, essentially. The rendering process, the mixing process was out of our control. And so one of the things that we get with the new Unreal Audio Engine is we know more about the sound as it plays. So we have this information, and one of the things that we get out of it is a delegate and blueprints that will report the playback percent, right? And so knowing this, I devised a plan, and the idea was, okay, I can't control the tick, right? That's up to the video frame rate. But what I can do is realize that even though my tick execution might be late, I can figure out how late I am and then start the next clip essentially where it should have started, right? So if you can imagine here, I'm playing my music clip A. I have this gap that until my next execution, then I can actually execute and I say, okay, well, how far should I be into music loop B? And then I'll just start there. And then to mask that gap, I just baked part of the music loop B into the music clip A. So this is all one file. And then it's past the point, so I have some sort of threshold, and Blueprints realizes, hey, I'm past my threshold. How far in should I be in music loop B, right? And then, okay, well, that's where I'll start playing, and let me do a crossfade. And the crossfade helps hand off the one file to the next file. So that was me getting out of, going into a loop, and then getting out of the loop. I was like, hey, I'm waiting for user input. So what I'll do is I'll just transition on the next tick. So if the user sends an event to my system, hey, I need you to transition, then I'll just transition on the next one. And what I'll do in this case is I just baked the loop into the transition clip of the next transition. So that way I could actually anywhere I was in the loop, I could just crossfade immediately, and then just continue on. So so that's kind of the approach that I took with this particular project, and it worked out. And if you've got the kite music music sequencer video, this would be the time to play it.
Is this a UI and stuff that you've built?
Say it again?
Is this a UI that you've built?
Yeah, so I didn't bring in their project. The project was internal, so I just made a UI for it. This was so we could take it to GDC and just have something to show people, and they could interact with it simply. But as you can see here, the current asset is listing the actual file that's playing, and you can hear the transitions are successful as I move from a loop to a transition, or a transition to a loop. So here I'll press continue. And now we're playing a new file. And so, yeah, it's a very nice piece. It's a very nice piece of music. However, this was designed for a very specific presentation, right? The approach that I took when I built this blueprint was very specific. And I think that it's a good sort of habit to get into, that once you work on it, like I didn't have much time to build this. I think I had just a couple days. We were working on other GDC demos, and so it was just sort of like added on to my pile. So I squeezed it in a couple days to work on some of this and another project and some sound for it. But yeah, I think that what's a good sort of practice or habit to get into is, once you've built something like this that you think, hey, this actually works pretty well, is to figure out how you can generalize it for maybe, a broader use. So yeah, there's another transition. And so as you can see, I can also track the progress using that delegate, and I just fill a progress bar. Why not?
Everyone loves progress bars. They're
Yeah,
progressive.
Exactly. And then here's the final transition. So now we're playing the last little piece.
And so you said you put the whole thing together in a couple of days. Is this something that Now that you've kind of figured out the way that it works, it makes it easier to implement into other projects in the future for you?
Yeah, so that's the idea. Yeah. What I decided, well, okay, so we brought it to GDC, and while it was at GDC, I didn't go to GDC. I continued working.
Okay.
But but if we can go back to the slides, the the idea, I sort of was like, okay, I need this, how can I generalize this? How can I sort of broaden, the functionality of this? So, and this is, I think, an important thing to just like, I cannot overemphasize this procedure. I think it's a really good thing to just always look back on the things you create, the build, and then see how you can add that thing to your tool set. Because what's cool about blueprints is you get that blank slate and you can build anything. But if you have something that is already 90% of what you want it to do, then just start there, right? And so building these tools and sort of accumulating them in your toolbox is just invaluable. So I decided to dog food it a little bit, right, with another music example, something a little more typical of an interactive music system, and I think this, it's important to mention that I am not prescribing a single approach for interactive music. I am just saying, hey, here's this thing I built. How can I make it even more useful? And I think that can continue, like an iterative process that continues to make this even more increasingly useful. But I was like, okay, well, let's try something a little more traditional, interactively traditional. So I created a music queue over a couple nights that basically had horizontal layers, which was something I didn't have in the kite music demo, so that I could have like control intensity level or something like that with additive layers, and then something that has maybe more interesting sequencing options. So I decided something simple. Like I only had a couple nights to work out the music, to actually write it. So I just went with a simple sort of like sequence of two bars that sort of go from an A, B to a C to a D and loops around like that. But at any of these junctures, it could select an ending that would be specific to that clip. Or adapted to that clip, that particular clip. And so, yeah, and then doing this actually helped me generalize the system further, and I actually, I'm already thinking of new things that I would like to try out and see if I can fit into this system. So it just continues to grow. So yeah, if you can play the ambient exploration music version. So this is implemented, and so you can see I changed the continue button is no longer a continue button. It's sort of like activity level.
Is that based on events in game or whatever might trigger another activity?
So it could be like the players. So this is like ambient exploration. So maybe the player is standing still or moving or something like that, right?
Gotcha. Or enters combat or whatever it may be.
Right.
Gotcha. That's really cool. Oh, so that's a slider.
Yeah, so I have a slider, and then what it does is it changes a target activity level.
I see, okay.
And then it will interpolate to that new activity level. And the interpolation allows me to have a more musical transition.
Gotcha. That's really cool. And this is 100% done in blueprints?
Oh, yeah. So now it will pick an ending clip. Cool.
That was neat.
So thank you. Yeah. So just one last acknowledgement before we dig into the blueprints, and that is just to sort of appreciate that any sort of music system is essentially a time-critical feature of your project, and that you need to understand that in that investment, you need to ensure that your project maintains any sort of time-critical standards, just like any other time-critical feature. Like, as an example, say a first-person shooter or a platform fighting game require high-frequency input processing, right? And in the case of, say, the Unreal Engine, that often means that you have to ensure that your project maintains a high video frame rate, right? And so just to keep in mind that, the higher and more consistent your frame rate will always result in better accuracy, and any sort of threading hitches or gameplay hitches will cause latent or sort of buggy responsiveness. And there's kind of, in some ways, there's no way around that particular thing as long as you're sort of driving everything by game thread logic. So yeah, that's just something to sort of acknowledge that despite all we want to do, we still need to take care of that, and so just know that going into your project. Personally, I am a very bad lighting artist, and so when I make levels, sometimes I put too many lights in my levels, and my frame rate drops, and then I'm like, darn it. So leave that to the experts.
Can you have
All right.
too many lights?
Oh, believe me. I need to figure out how to use ambient lights. I haven't figured that out yet. So it's point lights everywhere, dynamic everything. That's cool. Come on.
It's fine. It doesn't take a lot.
Okay. So there are instructions on there's an audio subforum on the Unreal forums, and there's a sticky in the audio subforum that gives you instructions on how to turn on the new Unreal Audio Engine. It's still early access. It's close. We're feeling it, but we still have it as early access. So you have to turn it on actively. But it's pretty simple. Like I said, there's instructions, so you don't have to remember this. But basically, inside your config, inside your config folder, you'll have a Windows platform directory, and then you'll add basically just this line that tells, hey, Unreal Engine, your audio device module name should be this one, and that just picks the new audio engine as the audio device module. So that's just a quick thing to keep in mind, because we're going to post a zip file of these assets, so you can check it out yourself, follow along or whatever. But you'll want to turn on. It won't work unless you have turned on the new audio engine. All right. So the approach I decided to take here was, first of all, I had these music files essentially that I had edited outside of my DAW or built inside my DAW and edited out, exported out. But I needed to pack a lot of information into each one, basically. So I created a custom struct that I just called a music clip struct, and it's pretty simple. It consists of a sound base, a little bool that lets me indicate that this is a looped file or not, because I wanted to treat those differently. I custom add in the clip duration, because if this is a sound cue and it's looped, then the duration will be like 10,000 or something like that, some ridiculously high number. So I just manually add the duration in, and manually add the time threshold that I would have my transition occur at. As I mentioned, you wait for a particular time, and then you say, okay, I'm ready to transition. Now transition. So in the case of my kite demo, the looped files are actually transition time 0, which means they're ready to transition at any moment. I would like, some way it would be great to automatically fill this data. That might be something we look at in the future. And then I created an array of integers that I designated as exit destinations. So the idea being that, okay, I'll store basically my whole queue inside of an array of these music clips. And then every music clip will say, well, I can go to some other music clip. My next music clip could be some other music clip, right? That's its destination. And so I just want to store it as an array index, something simple, just keep it super simple. And then I just added a string, say, hey, so I could add some arbitrary like state information. And I don't know how to use this. I use this currently for the UI presentation, but I don't know. There could be some other way to use that. I don't know. But that's the idea with the struct. And then basically what I created was I generalized my my music system from the original iteration of that kite music presentation. And the approach I decided to take here was to have a kind of a parent object, and then for specific cues to be children of that parent. That way I could fill them with specific data, or what's really powerful about blueprints, in my opinion, and this is kind of something, it's important to keep in mind, is that there is no music system to rule them all. There's no one in the world has the music system. And so every music system is going to cover some percentage of cases, but there's always going to be exceptions. And what's cool about blueprints is I can create a generalized actor to manage my music, but then I can override, as child objects, override specific functions inside of that parent, and then do something different, change the way that it functions. So I think that's super powerful. But basically, I have a start. Like I just create a simple API to interact with this music sequencer, this stitching system, starting the music, transitioning the music, and then stopping the music. And then in between, I'm tracking my play progress. And then I have a little edge case here. And then I print debug information. I always set up this on the tick. I like to do that where it's just like, hey, if I'm debugging, if this actor has a Boolean that's debug on, then print this data. That's always helpful when I'm building something. So essentially, as I go through the start music, I just check to make sure it's not already playing. If it is playing, I don't do anything, because that means that some reason the game or the user is trying to start the music over again. As it's already playing, don't need to start it. Then I start the tick. The tick is important. I actually keep the tick off. I don't like the ticking if I'm not using it. So I keep the tick off by default. But I start ticking because, as you'll notice here, I have two audio components, and they're going to alternate. As I'm stitching my music together, I'm handing one file off to the next file, to the next file. There has to be some overlap, and they have to be controlled independent of one another. So they need two audio components. But basically, to track playback progress, I will need tick on. So I enable tick once I'm set to start playing. And then I have a little function for initializing my play data, which is super simple. In the general version, I just say, hey, current clip is last. I just reset that data, and then I say is playing is turned on, right? Then I have a function for selecting my starting music clip. The default approach is to just pick the first index of my music clip array that I mentioned earlier. But I made all these separate functions because I want to be able to override them in child objects. And then I have a play music clip function, which says, okay, I'm ready to play. Oops, get over here. I pass in the music clip that I want to start playing, the playback start time, and whether or not to fade. So on the start, I might not want to fade in, but when I'm crossfading between two other clips, I probably want to do some sort of fade. So I just set as a bool, and then I set some local variables just so I can keep track of them, keep my blueprints a little bit cleaner. Crossfade time, for example, I do a little trick where I multiply it by the fade. If the fade is false, then it's a 0. And if fade is true, then it actually takes this public variable, which I can set for the particular type of music. And that's one of the things I wanted as a sort of main feature, was that different types of music can fade longer than other types of music. And the duration of that fade, has to respect the type of material that's in the music. So, like say strings, for example, might want to fade longer, but if you have a lot of like percussion, you might want to like really quick fade. So you want to be able to control that fade time on like a cue basis. All right, so I set up a bunch of local data. I break out my my music clip, and I start using that data that I had packed in to my music clip. Then I local translate. So yeah, just whether or not it's a looping thing. Am I trying to move to the next thing or not? And then what is my that threshold, right? So if it's a clip that's not waiting for the user to, like, if a loop is waiting for user input, it's waiting for manual transition. But if it's not a loop, then it's going to automatically transition, right? And so I need to know what's that threshold of percentage that's going to automatically transition, right? So if I have my file, I have my music clip A, and then a little bit of that music clip B, the whole file is a particular duration, but the actual transition point is smaller than that, right? So I get some sort of percentage when I divide one over the other, right? So that's what I'm doing here, is I'm getting that threshold of how far along in the music file should I be before I automatically fade to the next one. And then, is this an ending clip? I decided, okay, if my exit destination is a -1, then this is an ending clip, and then there will be no more transitions afterward. And then I just keep track of which audio component is currently being used, because I just want to say, hey, use one or the other, alternate between them, essentially. And then I have a separate function for implementing the crossfade, which I can override in child versions of this actor. The default is to simply say, hey, what's the component I'm fading in? Let me set the sound on that, and then let me start the fade in. And the fade in function is a linear fade in. And then I say, what's my fade duration? What's my start time? So how far in should I start on that particular file? And then I say, well, what is my fade out component? And then fade that out. And the fade out function automatically stops it when it's done fading out. So this is overridable. Linear fades are not appropriate for all types of music. Some music you'll want non-linear fade curves. So, and you can see in both of the cases that I've used here, I actually overrode this particular function. So then when we're done with that, we just head on out and we just pass in whatever we broke out of our music clip, basically, the data that we had just sort of saved here locally. Essentially, our transition threshold, whether or not this is automatically going to transition. It's just a one-time thing, and it's going to transition to something else, and then whether or not it's an ending clip. All right, and then I just pass that in, and so these are all private variables that are controlled by this this parent actor, and then I calculate, what is this is my current music clip. What is my next music clip? And this is actually something I did admit a last minute change actually. So this actually doesn't need to occur here. So you can delete it if you want, but we can talk about it still. And essentially the idea is, okay, given this array of exit destinations, what should my next index be? And then what I do is I as a default, I just say, hey, well, why don't I just do a random selection? So that's the default behavior, is just randomly select from that array. None of my, funny enough, none of my examples actually do random selection, but it's there. Why not, right? It's easy. And this is easy to override too. This is a separate function, so I can override it. And then based on that, I just grab my next music clip and I just feed it into, again, a private variable. Cool. And there it is. So, all right. Then when we want to transition, when a transition event is called, we just want to make sure if we're currently transitioning or not. And if we are not currently transitioning, then we want to transition when we're ready. That means we'll just wait until we're ready to transition. So in the case of in the kite music implementation, I thought, well, okay, I'm going in, if I'm going into a loop, but I'm ready to go once I get to the loop, then why not just go? So if I'm transitioning into the loop and I have my loop and I'm in my loop, ideally I'd be waiting in the loop for that command to say, okay, well, transition out of the loop. But if I'm transitioning, if I'm told to transition before I get to the loop, well, then I want to leave the loop as soon as I get there, basically. And so that's the idea, is I set this variable, just, hey, transition when you're ready. If we're not currently transitioning, then now we are currently transitioning, and so then we can begin the actual transition process. We just want to check some things first, make sure we're actually playing, because if we're not playing, then we've gotten some sort of false information from the user, and make sure that this is not an ending clip, because if this is an ending clip, then we're basically done. So then I do a little branch, and if those things are the case, then I just stop music sequencer. I just call stop. Otherwise, I select my next music clip, and this is actually the last minute change that I made. The order of operations, I decided to select the next music clip here in this part of the transition. That's why this one's actually unnecessary. I can actually delete this.
What made you make that change?
Yeah, so you'll notice in the ambient exploration video that when I told it to end, it actually waited an extra clip before it called the ending, and that was because I was grabbing I was calculating the next music clip to play at the end of my transition call. I was like, okay, play this next music clip, and then what's the next one going to be?
So it was finishing its current loop before it ended.
Yeah, exactly. So instead, I decided I'll pick the next one before I call play, and that way it's a little more responsive, a little more immediate.
Queued up and ready to go.
Exactly right. So the previous one was the attempt of queuing it up, but the problem is that information could change during the time it was queued up, and so I needed to reevaluate that essentially right before I decided to play the next thing. So this is much more immediate. And then, so I've got my next music clip. Then I just need to calculate the time for the next transition, right? So this is the sort of scary part, right? Because I'm trying to sort of figure out, like, okay, I've got this tick coming in, and it's obviously not synchronous to the things that I need to happen, and so I need to sort of try to understand what was supposed to happen, essentially, right? And so The way that I do this is first I set up, okay, well, what's the time for my next transition? And I basically take what is my current playing percentage, like how far am I through this particular file, right? And then I multiply that by my current music clips duration, clip duration, and then I subtract my transition threshold, right? So I basically convert the playing percentage, because I'm getting this percentage back. I convert it into a time value, right? So if I'm 80% through a 10-second file, I multiply 0.8 by 10, and I get 8. So I'm 8 seconds into the file, right? But if my threshold was at 6 seconds, I minus 6 seconds from that. So now I'm left with 2 seconds left. And so that the idea being like, oh, I'm 2 seconds in to my next file. And then
So
here
that
comes a
becomes your
little bit of a
transition?
hack. That becomes my next starting time.
Gotcha.
But I'm gonna like jigger some of the numbers a little bit. So there's a little bit of a hack, and this is where it gets a little scary. Is I add 2 frames of latency, and this is to account, I believe, for the round trip of the call. Hey, play the music file. The music file is playing on the audio thread. The audio thread comes back. This is how far I am from the into the file. So what I'm getting here is the currently playing percent is actually slightly inaccurate, and so I'm accounting for that, the trip that it takes to get that percentage back to me. So so that's a little sneaky part. If you're this is where you want to have consistent frame rate. If you don't have, if your frame rate's all over the map, then this is going to be an interesting thing. You might get some jitter here, but otherwise it should work. So so then I just need to say, okay, well, let's just wrap that around my next clip. What if my clip is really short? This hasn't happened, but it's just sort of safe. Like, let's be a little safe. I don't want to try to play time. I don't want to seek into a file that's not inside the actual time of the file that I'm going into. So I just put this in here just as a safety thing. I don't think it ends up actually happening, but just in case for some reason my leftover duration, my seek time is larger than the actual file I'm going into, then I just wrap it around. Because my assumption there is it's like some sort of loop or something. But then I just say, okay, well, that's my time for next transition. And then I just I need to get percentage back. So based on the time of my seek in, I need to get the percentage offset. This is a bug. This I've told Aaron about. This is new. We just discovered it because I did this. But there's a little bug with seeking into file. When you seek into file, the percentage is a little offset. So I offset the percentage, and it's a little bit of a trick. Hopefully we'll fix that bug, but until we do, this works. And then Blueprints is all about working. Sometimes you got to work with what you got in front of you, right? And then we just pass that out of the calculation. So we pass these into some private variables here. Private because I don't want anyone else to mess with it. And then if I'm debugging, I thought, oh, give me the local time. So I just grab a time check because I was doing some timing, checking my time and stuff like that on my debug process. But if I'm not debugging, then I just ignore that. And then I actually do I play my music clip at this function we've already gone through and the information that I get from that. So that's how I transition. Now, while I'm tracking my playback progress, one of the challenges that I had here was I could be getting, I don't know which one I'm on, so I have to track playback progress on either one. So I just say, okay, well, let's track playback progress on either one. And then I just do it's a little sneaky, just tracking some weird variables like but basically, hey, which component is actually active, and then based on that, I grab my percent reportage, whatever is reporting percentage playback, and then I feed it into a current percent playing percent, and then whether or not I'm transitioning, and if I am, so this seems like ridiculous, but it's not, and the reason is because I only want one of them to actually feed values, because they could be playing at the same time. So that's why you'll see they get it from different ones. And then, am I currently transitioning? If I am currently transitioning, then I am waiting for that threshold, right? So I'm my transition's in flight, and so I'm waiting for that threshold. And so if I'm waiting for that threshold, I'm just waiting for that threshold to hit, and once I hit it, then I implement my transition automatically. If I'm not currently transitioning, then I just check if I'm transitioning when ready, and if I'm not ready to transition, then don't do anything. If I am ready to finally transition, then I add a little bit of a delay, basically giving myself time to fade in to my loop, and then I execute a full call on the transition. And this is something that could be overridden probably, but it's a constant, and it's just I just set it as 4 times our fade value. So yeah, and then when we want to stop it, we just make sure, am I actually playing? If I'm playing, then cool. If I'm not, then don't do anything, because that's ridiculous. You don't need to stop something that's already stopped. And then I call a simple stop. The simple stop just does a fade out, but this could be overridden if you want some sort of more elaborate functionality. And then I set the state is playing to false. I give myself a couple of ticks delay, and then I disable the tick on the actor. And that last couple of ticks lets a couple things play out, to just sort of, hey, just give me a little buffer for my ticks to end. And then I had a little bit of an edge case. In cases where the audio component stopped playing, but the value B is playing is still true, then it just resets the play state and call stop. So that's the general functionality there. And then the kite music is super simple. I have a local array which I have defined here of my values, and then I pass that in on begin play, so it's ready to go. And then I overrode the crossfade with a custom timeline. So instead of the fade in fade out, I use a timeline with some nice nonlinear curves to play volume multipliers on the fade in and fade out components. And that's all of the overridden functionality in the kite music version. And then the ambient exploration version, I do the same thing. I just pass in a locally defined array. So here's my locally defined music queue with all the values in there. And then I just added that end music sequence because I wanted, I wanted the user to be able to both stop it like a regular stop, or to say end it nicely, right? And so ending it nicely just does this special case where when this is true, when this state is true, play out ending is true, then when I select my next music cue, I will select a specific one for that particular index. And then I had that. Actually, let me show you that. So I overrode the select next music clip. And so in this case, the natural next one, the continue playing, was always the index 0, and the index 0 from the exit destinations, or index 1 was the exit queue. So whatever that value was. And that's the only thing that I changed here. So basically, hey, what's my next one? If it's continuing on, then it's whatever is in whatever the value is at index 0. And then if I'm not, then index 1 and ends. So then I just have that activity level feature. So that means I need to tick a modulator. So here's where I update my interpolator. So I have my activity level, my activity target. I get my world seconds, so that's another reason it'd be ticking. And then I have an interp speed, which I can set based on the music cue. Like, obviously different kinds of music cues would have interpolation that is more or less musical to that type of aesthetic, right? Whatever you're going for. And then I update my modulators, and this is super simple. In the case of the ambient exploration, instead of using a sound wave, I use a sound cue with continuous modulators on the upper levels, the two upper layers of my activity. And so I take my activity level input, I multiply it by 2 as a quick, like, hey, I'm going to split this value up. And I clamp that output from 0 to 1 or from 1 to 2. I renormalize the 1 to 2 one to 0 to 1, but it's just taking the upper half. And then so my mid layer gets modulated from 0 to 1, and when my activity level gets over 1, or rather when my activity level is half, it gets exploded to 1, right? And then so that gets louder, but then it stops getting louder once I hit that ceiling, and then I start modulating my upper level. So quick way to sort of split that value in. And yeah, so that was super simple. If you look at the actual cues, they're very basic. You just have a base layer, a mid layer, and an upper layer. And the mid and upper just have modulators on the volume. And I use the same parameter name so that they all get controlled identically. So regardless of which one is currently loaded in the audio component that I'm communicating with, it'll all modulate the same way. So that's basically how it works. Yeah.
Ta-da!
Ta-da,
How are we on
the
time?
magic is revealed.
How are we on time?
We're doing all right.
Is that crazy?
We have some time to do Q&A.
I felt like I
if
spoke
you're
really
available.
fast.
No,
Yes,
I think you were good
totally
on time.
Chat.
I think it was a good
Okay,
good
good.
tempo.
Oh,
I used music puns.
we did.
Yeah.
We did. Okay, so we've got some questions. Let me find a good one.
Yeah.
They're all good ones. But, so they were talking about it towards the beginning a little bit. Like, they had read that you'd use timelines to control some of that. Is that performant in games?
Well, ticking in general is not performant, right? So you kind of have to pick your battles. And as you can see, I only use the timelines in the overriding of it. Otherwise, I use a simple fade. So, yeah, that's kind of where you have to look at your particular situation and go, this could use it, or maybe I shouldn't use this. You could, if you're already ticking, you could try just evaluating a curve, like a float curve. Just have a custom float curve. But you're starting to split a little bit. Then you have to listen. Hey, if my tick's too low, then it'll sound stepped, right? So you kind of have to face that bridge when you reach it.
Gotcha. So they were wondering if you tried experimenting with curves, since you sort of mentioned it, in the system in general, and if so, were there any notable issues or roadblocks utilizing those?
In this case, the curves I'm using are on the timeline. Absolutely, I wouldn't see anything wrong with using curves. Again, if you're evaluating a curve on a tick and you're trying to interpolate, then you might be running into some problems. Like I said, if your update tick is low, then you might hear a stepping.
Right.
So the So otherwise, you'll notice that I just use like that interp function, which where was it? Here, finterp2 is kind of a funny function, but it's nice smoothing, right? So in a way, it behaves kind of like a curve, but it's just sort of a smoothing function. But again, evaluated on the tick. So that's what that's why you still have to think of this as like a time critical system. Like so.
So
Right.
even if you
Make sure
have
that
like a
your
bad
project-
frame rate.
I think this will work if your frame rate is not too low, but it's consistent. I think it'll probably be okay. You might have to adjust some things, tweak some approaches that you take, but like the timeline might not work, right? You might just have to use that default fade in, fade out approach. So, yeah.
Cool.
Let's see. A little off track, but they were wondering, do you anticipate there will be tools in UE for analyzing audio, like analyzing the beats per minute or the key of a song or any of those kind of tools in the future?
I don't see why. Like, it's certainly possible. That becomes the actual development process becomes like this big huge list of prioritization.
Like, these are all the things we want.
And so there's like
yeah.
there's some actually really big fish that we want to fry first, or crabs that we want to bake first.
Poor
To
crabs.
bring it back around. Poor crabs.
They'll take out their baseline.
But what's cool is that because we have native DSP, it's certainly possible. I think what I would like to see earlier than that is actually just reading. I would like to see reading metadata, like if we could have markers or regions inside of our WAV files that have strings or something that we can then parse that information automatically. I think that would be super useful. I would probably argue for that before sort of auto analysis of BPM, because like, what does that even mean? What if I bring in a layer and the layer that I bring in is syncopated, right? So the rhythm is offset from the normal beat, but the idea is that it's offset, right? So then, if it's automatically trying to calculate BPM for that, then I'm going to lose that. Like, that just drops out really fast. So I think you find very, like, BPM calculation ends up being very narrow use case, unless you're doing something like user music or something like they've got an MP3 list or something like that they're bringing in. I don't know. I that's where I see it probably being more useful.
Right.
If you're already writing the music, authoring the assets, there's probably more valuable data that you could add to that. That, like, as an example here, nothing here cares about BPM. Like, there's no BPM or tempo information that I'm packing into my data. I don't care about that.
Gotcha.
I don't need it. I think the tick gets tricky when you're also trying to calculate rhythms and timings like that. You run into the same problems, and it gets harder and harder to mask those problems because you actually depend on the tick to calculate them.
Okay. Aaron suggested that we ask you to talk about procedural music a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. So I don't have a project up. There was a project that we showed at GDC that talked about where that was just basically a showcase for procedural music. There's actually a whole video presentation online with Procedural Audio Now, where Aaron and I talk about procedural music. I don't know. I could link that in the forums or something like that if people want to check it out. Or we could do some future stream where we go into more depth about something like that. But basically, procedural music it is kind of the case where you want super high frame rate or a frame rate that is musical. And that's where you would actually be ticking beats and rhythms,
Yeah.
and actually having blueprints select notes or instruments to play based on um, you know a procedural definition of the music composition. So like how does blueprints build a melody, right? And it's basically the idea behind a procedural music system, in my opinion. And I think there's a lot of conflicting views on what that actually entails or what makes a successful procedural music system. But for me, I'm very much a composer, and I like having control over my result. And so my approach to procedural music tends to be something with a lot of constraints. So when I am creating a melody, I will actually create conditions for picking the next note. And so there's some probability involved in how it picks the melodic sequence, but it's also constrained by all of my definitions so that it basically creates music that is aesthetically targeting my goals as a composer. So, and the same can be said of rhythmic motives or bass or pads or chords or any sort of like aspect of music. But essentially, that approach is a procedural approach is where the game engine is actually generating the sort of musical composition in a way by whatever definitions or algorithms you have defined as a composer, or you could think of yourself as a future composer, because it's like a very futuristic way of thinking about writing music. But this there are this kind of approach, this music stitching approach, like I said, is actually taking advantage of things that would be impossible in a more procedurally defined music composition. So, for example, I have at my command a lot of virtual instruments at home and effects and things that aren't built into the Unreal Engine, and that I can do more planning. And if I wanted to record a performer, I could do that, right? And so if I wanted to say like I love working with performers, and if I wanted to record a performer, that melodic or whatever they play would have to be predefined essentially, unless I wanted to like chop up their performance into little pieces. And the smaller those pieces, the less sort of predefined. And so that there are benefits to a very well phrased musical performance that gets really challenging to try to suss out in a procedural music system. I think there are opportunities for a variety of approaches, and I don't think I don't think that it's. I don't want anyone to take this this presentation as prescriptive in any way. Like it's not. It's like here is one way to solve this problem, and as you can see, the way I tried to frame this was I was actually solving a very specific music problem. And then I was like, well, how can I generalize this? But I think there's opportunities here, even in this structure, to try to build in procedural elements. Like you could have some random element that sort of litters variation over what you're listening to. And I think that's like in some ways shares a space with animation. Like animation and music share a lot of the same problems. Like beautiful animation comes from hand authored and or hand edited animation, right? You could record someone's very natural performance and then edit elements like facial features or hand features, gestures or whatever, and then bring that into your game and then try to stitch that together. How you blend them together or how you blend multiple animations together is the same thing as I'm trying to do here. I'm stitching musical performances together, and then I am blending between musical performances. And I think from a procedural standpoint, you could look at well, how could I add or alter this in a way that is even more responsive or dynamic. And I honestly think you could just make whatever you wanted with Blueprints. Like, Blueprints is amazing.
Really empowers those of us that are not programmers.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's really close to programming. It's just a little friendlier, right?
Yeah.
It's visual programming.
It's very close. It's yeah, exactly right. It's very intuitive, and the Blueprints team here at Epic do a really amazing job. I love those guys. So yeah, I hope that satisfies Aaron's request.
No, so you were talking about the procedural. Are you familiar with any games that have really utilized procedural music?
Well, Aaron's example is famous, right? Aaron worked on Spore, so that's not a fair question. But I think that a lot of successful soundtracks, responsive soundtracks, combine elements of music stitching and procedural music building construction. And there are some great talks out there, like I think is Crystal Dynamics Tomb Raider peeps have a really great talk about a procedural drum system. I think that Rhyme out of Ninja Theory, I think there's some interesting ambient approaches that I think he takes advantage of the sort of, when you have a fluid ambient music, you can kind of create this really beautiful ambience, and I suspect that there's some sort of procedural nature to how some of those phrases are picked.
Mm-hmm. Let's see.
I think
Aaron
yeah.
mentioned
Yeah,
All
what
Walls
is it?
Must Fall as an indie game.
Oh,
or
yeah,
is an
yeah.
indie game that has a music system in place made in Blueprints.
Yeah,
those
totally. They have a crazy their system is crazy. I think they have a Gama Sutra article on that. You should totally check it out.
Yeah, he dropped it in the chat if you're interested.
Cool. Yeah.
Hey, Rhyme is also interactive music.
Yeah.
I'm familiar with Rhyme quite well. I worked on Rhyme before here. So.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Excellent.
So we had somebody asking, how well does this sync with in-game elements? So if you had a clock in-game and you wanted the ticks to be both in time with the game music, but also with the clock's like hand animation.
Well, again, you would need to constrain your frame rate. So if you have a clock in your actual game, presumably it's actually updating visually on the frame rate. So you might be safe there. But jitter or timing differences might be more audible than visual. Like you might notice them more because they're sound oriented than when they're visually oriented. So again, you just want to make sure that you are keeping care of your frame rate, and then I think your everything else will be fine. So, and there's no end to the way that I approach this is with the child objects allows me to define specific behavior for my particular music cue to override behavior, and so I could add anything I wanted to the input for my particular cue, and that way I want you to kind of think outside the box, like, where could you take this, and what is the specific. I think you should bring it back to that sort of compositional goals, like what are you trying to achieve with music in this part of the game or production, right? What is this supposed to feel like, and in what way can you respond? Like, what kind of data do you have in your game, and how can you interpret that as something that can be distilled into a system, essentially? So, the example I gave with the ambient exploration music, it would be some sort of activity target, right? And the activity level changes, and that is fairly immediate, right? So I think that there are opportunities for whatever you have in mind.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's most of our questions for today.
Cool.
And thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah. It's my pleasure.
Do we
Thanks for
look up
having
at
me.
him? Is that what?
Oh,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
It's. I feel like it's been a while since we've had an audio stream, and it's nice to get you all back on, and we'll have to drag Aaron up here one of these days too.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
Because there's
This
a
is
lot of
super cool.
updates that you've all have put on in the engine, and we need to tell the whole world about all those
Yeah.
things.
Music
We
is
do.
amazing. It's
So much
such
to
a
talk about.
such an integral part of the game that I think just having a universal system within the engine that people can use, I think, is going to make games even better. You know, past the visuals.
Yeah.
So.
So yeah, thank you so much. For all those at home,
Thank you.
I've dropped a survey in the chat. Please fill it out. That lets us know, let us know how we're doing, what topics you would like to see in the future. If you'd like to see more audio streams, tell us about that. And then
Say
also,
yes. Yes, you need to see more audio streams.
more audio streams. As always, submit your projects to the NVIDIA Edge program. We want to see all those things. And let me send you a 1080 Ti, like, who doesn't want that? And check out your area for local meetup groups. There's a lot of great people in cities doing cool projects that should be able to help you out, offer you advice. So that's on meetup.com/pro/Unreal Engine. Lots
And
of
that's
good
around
stuff
the
going on.
world.
Yeah,
It's not just
globally.
anywhere. And if there's not a group, you can start one.
Yeah, you can
So-
always start one if you're like, hey, I want to be the champion of my city because no one else has taken up this mantle. You can do it.
I will bear this burden. So
Burden, this honor.
I was trying to quote a movie.
All right. So thank you again, guys, and we will see you next week.
Take care, guys.
Bye.